For the week that you guys are here and for the number of sessions that we'll have together, what I was asked to do is a series on some of the more metaphysical teachings in Judaism. So what I'm going to be covering is the general flow of events from the end of days, then the period which we call Armageddon, or Gog uMagog, the wars of Gog and Magog, the wars of Armageddon, and then moving into the Torah's teachings on the world to come, what that means, and possibly we'll get into discussion of resurrection as well. So that's generally the direction that we're taking. The end of days, the wars of Armageddon, the world to come, and resurrection. Today we're going to be talking about the first part of this kind of flow of events, which is the end of days. The end of days in the more Talmudic literature is called Acharit Hayamim, okay? The end of days. The rabbinic literature calls it Ikvasa de Mashiach. Ikvasa is like the Hebrew word Ekev, and Mashiach is the Mashiach, which means the period which is on the heels of the coming of Mashiach. So it's actually referring to the period up to and even including at least part of the period of Mashiach. After that period, after the coming of Mashiach, and the resolution of things in a more positive way, we would call that more the period associated with Olam Haba, the world to come. The period of Ikvus and Mashiach, or let's say the end of days in general, is divided into basically three periods. The first period is the period which is the warming up of the world towards the coming of Mashiach. The second period would be the period which could also be very tumultuous, just before and even during the actual appearance of Mashiach. Those would be the first two phases. And then, after that, you've got this period of the world to come. So, Ikvus Mashiach, or Achris Yamim, is really referring to, or let's say, put it this way, Achris Yamim is referring to all of those periods. Ikvus Mashiach would be referring to the first two. The characteristics of this Ikvus Mashiach are spelled out in great detail in our sources. And that's part of what we're going to go through. The sheets that I gave you is a list of specific descriptions of the Ikvus Mashiach, which we'll only be talking about later on, at the very end of towards the end of the talk today. But before we actually get through the specific list of description, or this list of specific aspects of Ikvus Mashiach, we have to understand some of the background information. First of all, very important qualification we have to remember is that when we're talking about the types of cataclysmic, world-changing, tumultuous events that are described in our sources as taking place during this period, the final period, approaching the period of redemption, it doesn't necessarily have to happen in that grandiose, cataclysmic, tumultuous type of a way. It can happen in a much more pleasant and smooth and fluid, beneficial point as well. It really all depends on us, and we'll see more about that as we go along. To the extent to which we merit the redemption, or to the extent to which God has to impose that redemption on the world. If we merit it, of course, things will be much more fluid. And otherwise, it could be potentially much more difficult. The sources, for example, in the book of Daniel, talk about and give us an indication that the suffering that might be as a result of getting the world prepared for the coming of Mashiach and the resolution of this whole question about whether God exists and what does he want from us, the description in Daniel describes a scenario which is understood by the commentaries to be much worse than anything the Jewish people ever experienced. Much worse than the exile in Egypt. Much worse than the destruction of the first temple or the second temple. And arguably even worse than, God forbid, the most tragic event that's happened to the Jewish people in recent times, which is the Holocaust. Although there are some people who say that the actual event of and the suffering of the Jewish people of the Holocaust represented the actual crescendo, the pinnacle of this period of Ikvus Mashiach, and from that point on, it's really only in the movement of getting better and better. It's hard to know for sure where the Holocaust fits into the way things are going to play out. But in any case, the sources describe that this period of Ikvus Mashiach, which are on the heels of the coming of Mashiach, is not going to be an easy period at all. The Gemara in Sanhedrin actually records one of the sages of the Talmud saying as follows: "Let it come, but let me not be there to witness it." Meaning, I certainly want the events of the world to come into fruition, and so that all the prophecies will come true, and all of the tensions, the spiritual tensions in the world will be resolved, but it's going to involve so much calamity, so much dissonance, that let it come, but I don't want to be there. It's too much. There's too much suffering. The Vilna Gaon actually describes it to labor pangs, saying that just as labor and the difficulties of labor, or of pregnancy, increase towards labor, and then within labor itself, as birth approaches, the labor pangs become greater and greater and more frequent, so too, when the world is this new situation of redemption is birthed into the world, the period preceding it is going to involve labor pangs, and those pangs are going to be more and more intense and more frequent as we get closer and closer to the birth. Once that birth occurs, Mashiach arrives, and the world starts to become resolved of all these tensions, there will be a great relief. But until then, right, it's going to cause great pain, great suffering, and people might even be crying out, even though they're looking forward to the realization of the birth of redemption, but while they're experiencing it, it's going to be very, very difficult. Jewish sources reckon when this end of days is going to be. Right? When it's going to be. It's important to know that even though throughout Jewish history, different Jewish commentators gave different appointed times for Ichvaz Mashiach and the coming of the Mashiach, none of them so far have come true. Any estimate of when it would be has already passed. That doesn't mean that the Gemara's discussion about when it will be, or commentators' kind of extrapolation about when it would be wrong. What they were doing is they were seeing times, junctures in time, which would be propitious for the coming of Mashiach and all of this process of the end of days that's going to happen. If it didn't happen in those appointed times, it's not because they were wrong, because they were really forecasting times which were propitious for this process. What happened was, we, the Jewish people, did not merit the redemption taking place at that time, in which case it passed. Okay? But just as they predicted times in the past, which didn't occur there will still be an appointed time sometime in the future for these events to take place. That being said, the Jewish sources, the Gemara and Sanhedrin in particular, talks about a specific time period where within that framework, within that spectrum, it's most likely for these events to start happening. And the explanation basically is as follows, that there are 2,000 years since creation, which are described as tohu uvohu. Does anybody know what that means? What's that? It's actually a word in English. If you check it out in the English dictionary, you'll find tohu uvohu. It's one of those words which in Hebrew was accepted as an English word. It's in the dictionary. Tohu uvohu literally in Hebrew means like void. It's the description of the world before it was actually created. It's a term in the creation story. That before God crystallized creation, creation was in a state of tohu uvohu. It was discombobulated existence, fluid without any specific form. So the Gemara says that the first 2,000 years from the time of creation is actually an extension of this period of tohu uvohu. What does that mean? We're certainly talking about 2,000 years when the world existed as it does now. Why was it referred to as tohu uvohu? The reason is because it's based on a teaching which says as follows. In the creation story, there's a verse which says, Yom HaShishi v'yechulu hashamayim v'aretz v'chol tzva'am. It was the sixth day, and God created all of the heavens and earth and all that they contained. Okay? The Gemara notes a grammatic point. In creation, it says, X, Y, and Z happened, day 1. X, Y, and Z happened, day 2. The same thing with day 3, day 4, day 5. However, on the sixth day of creation, the Torah says, not day 6, but the sixth day. It's from here that our sages teach the following teaching, that when God created, He created creation on condition that what? That the Jewish people should, at some time in the future, receive the Torah. On what day? The sixth day. The understanding of the Torah's use of the term Yom HaShishi is a reference to the sixth day of the month of Sivan, which was earmarked for the time when the Jewish people would receive the Torah. And God said, if the Jewish people will receive the Torah on that sixth day of Sivan, mutav, wonderful, everything will be great. But if not, because of course they had free will, they could have chosen not to accept it, then God says everything will be reverted back to tohu uvohu, a state of non-creation. Meaning the whole purpose of creation was in order that the Torah should be part of the world, either among humanity in general, and if humanity in general forgoes it, at least within the Jewish people, so that they can catalyze its spreading to the rest of the world. But in any case, Torah is a precondition for creation. Therefore, these first 2,000 years, from the time the world was created until the Torah was given, are described as tohu uvohu because the world was like in limbo. Will the Jewish people receive the Torah, or will they not? Will they yes, or will they not? Until they received it, we didn't know what the answer was, and therefore the world was tantamount to being in a state of tohu uvohu, non-created. That's the first 2,000 years. This first 2,000 years is described as being a time where Mashiach and Achris Hayamim, the end of days, is not likely to happen, and we know it didn't. Why is it not likely to happen? Because there's no instruction yet about how things should be done. Torah hadn't been given yet. So that brings us to the next period, the next 2,000 years, which is described as the 2,000 years of Torah. These 2,000 years of Torah are reckoned from the time of Abraham, Avraham Avinu, until the destruction of the second temple. From the time of Avram, who started to promulgate the teachings of godliness into the world, that represented an introduction on a mass scale of the teachings of Torah into humanity. And Avraham was named Avraham because he became an Av lehamon goyim, a father of many nations. Abraham is a spiritual father for many, many nations. How so? The Jews, even though we don't represent very many. But he's also a spiritual father for Islam, Christianity, which preceded Islam, and then Islam. Yeah, millions, billions of people across the world are spiritual recipients of the teachings of Avram. So that Avram actually catalyzed the second 2,000 period, which was referred to as the period of Torah. And this was the period in which the belief in God is to be spread and proliferated. And that's how it was done, through Judaism, a light into the nations, which ignited the interest in God among Christianity, and then Islam. It's all there, the next 2,000 years. This is already a period where the world could come to its fruition. Things could come to their conclusion. If humanity accepts the existence of God and the sovereignty of God, then that already is moving the world in the right direction. If they don't, it's also a time in which God can start imposing, right, the resolution into the world as well. So this would also be the first period, the next 2,000 years, when that could happen. However, it did not happen, and that period closed, according to the Ramban. It closed approximately around the time of the destruction of the second temple. Rambam makes an interesting point that Christianity and Islam were actually either tolerated or perhaps even inspired by God in order to wean the non-Jewish idolaters away from idolatry and to prepare them for the belief in one God. And the Rambam actually writes that through the teachings of Christianity and Islam, humanity is asking questions like, is there a God? Is there a Mashiach? If so, who? So Rambam says that Christianity and Islam are actually engaging humanity with a dialogue about belief in God in order to wean them away from idolatry and prepare them for the coming of the Mashiach. So then you have the third period of the 2,000 years. The third period of the 2,000 years is called the period of Mashiach. Now, Mashiach could have come earlier. It didn't. But Mashiach will come at some time during this last 2,000 years. We don't know exactly when it will be, but according to Jewish sources, it will certainly be within this last period of 2,000 years. Like you mentioned, we're in the year 5,775. Yeah? According to Jewish sources, Mashiach has until the year 6,000. How many years do we have left? 225. Okay. 225 years left. You guys are good at math? Yeah? A little over 200 years left. A lot has got to happen in those 200 years if it's going to happen. Okay? But the time appointed is going to be that. Now, the sources say that regarding the redemption, that it's going to come in what's called in the verse, Bi'ito achishena. In its time, I will bring it speedily. The Gemara notes that this verse is contradictory. I will bring it speedily in its appointed time. If it's got an appointed time, it can't be sped up. And if it's something that can be sped up, then it doesn't have an appointed time. So the Gemara actually explains what this means is there are two ways that it can happen. It can happen if we merit it. It'll be sped up and brought as soon as possible. And that will be beneficial for everybody. However, even if we don't merit it, it doesn't come about on our own accord. There is a final appointed time beyond which things cannot continue as they are. The world as we know it will change. And that would be the year 6000. 225 years from now. Yeah.
When's the last time that you predicted Mashiach to come? You just said till the year 6000, but you also mentioned before that there was a time you said you should have come already.
Yeah, so there were times which were predicted in the past.
When was that?
There are different calculations. Different rabbis made different calculations about what those years would be. Yeah. But
who made this calculation?
What's that?
Who made this calculation?
This is the Talmud. The Talmud says, that the final time where it's promised to happen is the year 6000. If it doesn't happen by then, but what if it doesn't happen? Yeah. Then what? Okay? We'll see. Yeah, but until that point, right, we're dealing. What's that? We won't. Somebody. So we won't have to deal with that problem. Yeah, if it doesn't happen, God forbid, yeah, so whoever's living then is going to have to deal with the theological implications of it not happening. But until that point, the Jewish sources say that it will happen sometime before the year 6000. Sometime before the year 6000, it will happen. What?
Haven't there been 6,000 periods in the past that expired without us meriting the arrival of the Mashiach?
Do you mean other cycles, previous cycles?
Yes.
Yes, you could say that.
So why is this cycle different from other cycles? Why are we so sure the Mashiach will come at the year 6000 if he didn't,
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. If the world was created and destroyed, I'm not saying that's necessarily the case, but it's a possibility. There's such an idea which was out there. According to that, then they had a period where they could have merited this resurrection, this redemption, and they didn't. But here, within this 6000 cycle, we are told that Mashiach will arrive and the world will come to this resolution sometime between the 6,000 years. We hope it will be sooner because we merit it. Even if we don't, it will be imposed upon the world. That will be the scenario that is described in this Achris Yamim, these final days, which are not described in the most pleasing terms. But what's going to be the description of these final days? And let's see whether that corresponds to anything that we're experiencing nowadays. There are basically two general characteristics about the period of the end of days, which our sources describe. And one of it is a rampant lack of belief in God. And Jewish sources, whether it be the prophets or whether it be the Talmud, talk about how towards the end of days there is going to be a mass departure on behalf of the Jewish people away from a belief in Torah. The Rambam, in his famous Igeres Teman, writes the following. He says, our sources have already revealed to us that toward the end of the exile, as a result of our suffering, many Jews will come to doubt, be led astray, and eventually abandon their religion. And all this will be because of our lowly position in the exile and the elevated status of the non-Jews. But a few will still remain loyal and not become confused.
I thought it was the other way around, where everyone, I always hear that if every Jew keeps Shabbat, then Mashiach is more likely to come.
That's right, but
isn't it saying the opposite?
No, because what we're saying, if every Jew were to keep Shabbat or keep two Shabbosim, then Mashiach would come. But the point is, right, the description of the Jewish people at the time of the end of days is not really conducive to that.
Is the end of days the days before Mashiach?
Yes.
Basically, when everybody stops keeping faith in Judaism and everything goes to hell, that's when it is.
But isn't that the opposite to everyone's keeping Shabbat?
So what that teaching is saying is that if everybody at any time in history were to do that, yes, then it would come. But even that statement resonates with the other teaching that we're dealing with. Why? Because that's assuming a situation where people are not keeping Shabbat. And if everybody were to keep Shabbat, then Mashiach would come. So it's actually in line with what we're saying here. The prediction is that towards the end of days, the Jewish people are going to be, by and large, lacking a belief in God. At that time, if something were to stir them to a great level of observance, and everybody would keep the Shabbat simultaneously in the name of God and the Shabbos, so that would be a way of catalyzing the coming of a Mashiach in a good way. But it's not going to necessarily, it's not necessarily going to happen that way. It's conditional. You think?
Shouldn't it be kind of be preached then that Jews should basically follow this piece of paper and Mashiach will come?
No, we want the Mashiach to come earlier. This is like if
Yeah.
Yeah, you
This
came
was
in.
happening
You came in a
in
bit late.
So I'm talking about in 5999 or 5995.
Yeah. So you came in. You came in a bit late, but let me just read at the point, and then I want to go on, which is that the prediction of things happening in a non-pleasant way is a result of the Jewish people's not observing. But they certainly have the option at any time to turn back to God, in which case the redemption will take place in a much more fluid and pleasant way. So it's unconditioned. Yeah.
So it could happen that we bring it early just because we're doing the right thing, or if it doesn't happen, then it's going to turn to this where it's like, it's going to hit the bottom.
Yes. 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 That's the idea of bi'ito achishenu. Yeah. At its appointed time, I will speed it up, which is self-contradictory.
Right, so why wouldn't we just,
Why wouldn't what?
well, yeah, why wouldn't we just, if we could speed it up by doing the opposite and then flipping it around?
Speed up by doing opposite, which we would speed it up through observance.
Just like say, let's get as destitute as possible so that then everything will, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
If this is the prediction, why don't we speed up this prediction as opposed to the other?
No, because you're not going to bring it about any faster by being worse. On the contrary, right? Being worse is just going to delay it. The way to speed it up is by returning to God. Returning to God will catalyze God's returning in full to the world. What what this teaching is saying is there's a promise, which is even if the Jewish people do not return to God, and even if they reach the lowest of the low, God still guarantees that He's going to do a restart on the world, right? But that restart is going to, involve shutting things down, and you don't want to shut off your computer unnecessarily, yeah. But you might have to override everything, press the restart button, yeah. But that will happen. That's the point. It's a guarantee that even if we don't deserve it, it's going to happen at some final time. But when it happens in that way, it's actually going to be imposed on the world against its will, and that's not going to be pleasant. Yeah.
Why do so many people believe in false messiahs?
And why do so many people believe in false messiahs?
Yeah, like why do 1 billion plus people actually believe Jesus was like Messiah?
So this gets back to the point that I was saying in the name of the Rambam, where in preparing the world to make the choice to receive the Mashiach, God has an intermediary stage of weaning the idolaters away from their idolatrous beliefs and introducing them to the ideas of monotheism. And Christianity and Islam, according to the Rambam, is about doing that, introducing the teachings of monotheism into the world, even if it means an intermediary stage where they're lacking clarity. But they do believe in the concept of Mashiach. At some point, it will be clear that who the Mashiach really is. But in the meantime, Christianity and Islam are like vehicles through which monotheism is being spread into the world in order to get all of humanity on board with the questions about, is there God or is there not? What does it mean that there's one God? What does it mean that the world should be something, the world can be rectified and should be, and we have responsibility in doing so? And that this will ultimately come into fruition through Mashiach and the revelation of God in the world. These are all things that Christianity and Islam are engaged with and engaging humanity with as well.
So would you rather be, if someone wasn't Jewish, would you rather them be a devout Christian or Muslim rather than non-Jewish?
Rather than idolater, yes, but not. But you'd rather than be a Noahide, which is somebody who is who believes in monotheism as strictly defined by the Torah for non-Jews. That would be the ideal. Yeah. But the point is that Rambam says that God is actually using Christianity and Islam as a vehicle through which humanity is being brought back to the state of Eden, which is where it started. We do find, you're talking about believing in false messiahs. I wasn't sure exactly what you meant, but we do find that in modern times, the human desire and yearning for redemption has taken the form of believing in false messiahs, most of them ending with the term ism. Socialism, communism, nationalism, capitalism. Yeah, all of these winds of isms that are blowing through the modern world at a very fast rate are all about this type of thing. It's like an expression of humanity's developing yearning for a rectification of the world, putting their belief in some type of Messiah. But since these are false messiahs, it can actually end up in a very destructive belief. For example, the combination of nationalism and socialism, National Socialism, which wasn't very good for humanity. But the point is, all of these winds of isms are being stirred by this period of history approaching the coming of Mashiach, where the world is approaching its fruition, where things are coming into a preparation for Mashiach. Another general categorizing in our sources of this period is not only a lack of belief on the part of the Jewish people in God, but also a lack of commitment to the Torah and mitzvot. And we see, 2,000 years ago, our sources already predicted the period that we live in, where most Jews across the globe do not believe in God. And if they do believe in God, it's only a very weak and tenuous belief. And even those don't really believe in the Torah being divine, or if they do, that the mitzvahs are relevant, which means that by and large, the majority of the Jewish people nowadays, unfortunately, do not believe in God, do not believe in the Torah, are not committed to the keeping of the mitzvot. And this was all predicted thousands of years ago by people who did believe and were committed to performing the mitzvot. So in their prophetic wisdom, they already gave us an insight to the period, to our period, which seems to fit the description of the end of days. In which case, we should be looking more closely to see whether in a more specific way, our period somehow should indicate to us that we are approaching this period of the end of days, which was in fact asserted by many of the scholars of the modern period, starting with scholars from before World War I, in between the two world wars, and certainly after World War II. But one other introductory comment is based on the Vilna Gaon's explanation of the famous story in the Torah, which talks about how Jacob, when returning from exile, when he was serving Lavan, remember, the father of his two wives, Rachel and Leah, on his return from his sojourn in exile with Lavan, he comes into the land of Israel, and he encounters who? His brother? Esav. Yeah, and we're told in the story, we're told in the Torah there that what happened is that Yaakov sent his two secondary wives with their children before Esav, and they bowed down to him. And then he sent Leah with her children in front of Esav, and they bowed down to Esav. And finally, he sent Rachel and her son, and they bowed down before Esav. At that point, the power of Esav was negated. And Yaakov continued on his way into the land of Israel and established the Jewish presence there. But the Vilna Gaon makes the following comment, that there's a general rule of thumb in the Torah, Ma'aseh avos simon lebanim. Things that happened to our forefathers were like spiritual prototypes of things that would happen to the Jewish people throughout history. And he says that this whole story of Jacob's returning to the land of Israel, encountering Esav, is actually portends what's going to happen to the Jewish people upon their returning from the longer exile into the land of Israel, which is happening right now in our times. The Jewish people are leaving the exile and returning to the land of Israel. But first they encounter the forces of Esav. Esav represents the powers in the world which are opposed to Torah, opposed to belief. And what the Vilna Gaon says is that all of the Jewish people are going to become subjugated to this outlook of life, which is Esav. And Esav, generally in Jewish sources, indicates the modern, well, not necessarily modern, but represents the influence of the European nations on the world. And we know that modern history is really a result of Western imperialistic divvying up of the world on part of the European powers. And all of the mess that we have in the world today in international politics comes about because of colonialism. All of that was because of Esav's voracious desire to consume and be indulgent in the physical world. That messes up the Jewish plan for things, because while Judaism recognizes the importance of the physical world, ultimately the purpose is that it be subjugated to a spiritual end. Esav is not about that. It's about this worldliness. And therefore the Vilna Gaon says that this story in the Torah portends a time when all of the different groups of the Jewish people are going to be subjugated, bowed down to the forces of the European influence in the world. Not only the more peripheral Jews, which would represent to the secondary wives and their children, will bow down to Esav. Not even the more integral Jews, meaning the Jews who are closer to belief and practice, corresponding to Leah, one of the primary wives, and her children, that would refer to the believing and practicing Jews, but even the Jews that correspond to Rachel and her son, or her sons, well, Yosef and Binyamin, she was pregnant with Binyamin, representing the believing Torah Jews, the believing Jews who are also Torah learners. They will all be subjugated to Esav. And ultimately, just as Yaakov had this wrestling throughout the night with the angel of God, and that angel was the angel of the nation of Esav, the result of that wrestling match between Jacob, and Esav was that Esav harmed Yaakov. Where? You know the story? On the thigh, his leg. Okay? And the Jewish sources say that this is an indication that at some time in the future, meaning the end of days, the main way in which Esav is going to disable the Jewish people is by harming their legs. What are the legs? The legs are the parts of our body which support us. Okay? This represents the powers that support Torah. Torah is supported upon two pillars. The two pillars are, number one, our children, and number two, the wealthy people who support Torah learning. This is an indication, he says, that towards the end of days, the Jewish people, Jacob, is going to become crippled. Their support is going to become weakened because Esav is going to have such significant inroads into those two pillars upon which the Jewish people are supported. Their children, and think about what a problem we're having with Jewish education, young Jewish people wandering away from Judaism, no longer interested in Judaism or the Jewish identity, more interested in non-Jewish culture, resulting in intermarriage. The children are unfortunately leaving Judaism en masse. That's the one thing. And secondly, those who are wealthy are not observant, and even observant Jews don't find enough reason to support those who are studying Torah. It's not considered to be important enough for the preservation of the Jewish people. And for those two reasons, right, towards the end of days, even Rachel and Yosef, which represent the pillar of Torah among the Jewish people, is going to become weak and crippled. These are the kind of general descriptions of the end of days, which we actually see unfolding before our very eyes. A departing en masse of the Jewish people from belief in God, a lack of commitment to the mitzvot, and in particular, right, a weakening of commitment on the part of the children, on the part of those who study Torah. And it's for this reason that that we're having such a problem with intermarriage and people departing and choosing other options, aside from the Jewish options. So this is kind of the overview of the general period of the end of days. Now let's go into more specific descriptions, one by one, of the teachings regarding what the events of, or what the milieu of the end of days is going to be like. So this is where you have this package now, this sheet. Does anybody have one? Does anybody not have? So this is based on a teaching in the Gemara in Sota, page 49b, and the Gemara there in Sota enumerates descriptions, characteristics of the end of days. Let's go through them one by one. The first one is insolence will increase. Insolence will increase. What does this mean? This universal, hedonistic, materialistic, self-indulging approach to life, which really characterizes the modern world, a voracious, insatiable appetite to devour and to consume and to please and to receive pleasure, right? This is what's going to increase in the world. Secularly educated children have no interest whatsoever in spirituality. It's all about material benefit, getting the grade in order to get into the school, in order to get the job, in order to get the money, in order to have the greatest income, in order to what? Go on and on and on. Join the rat race, the ever-ending cycle of earning money. But so many of these wealthy people are so poor, they're so unhappy in life. Why? Because they're constantly running after something which is essentially ephemeral and fleeting. But this is going to be one of the main characteristics of the end of days, which is this insolence will increase. People are going to be interested only in hedonistic, self-fulfilling self-fulfillment and indulgence after a material type of a lifestyle. I don't think we see any culture like our own where advertising and money and marketing is emphasized so greatly in order to call upon and stir up people's desires. Billboards are full of, right, tempting ads. Yeah, take a sip of this. Yeah, whether this is a beverage, whether this is a woman, whether this is a vacation, whatever, millions and millions of dollars, right, go into advertising in order to make sure you buy what they want you to want. And they market it, and they produce it, and they sell it, and you consume it in a way which makes sure you're going to come back for more, and more, and more, and more. And if there's something new, you've got to get it. And soon that will become old, you've got to replace it, or you've got to upgrade it. More and more and more and more. And that's what we find nowadays. Why? Because people are lacking the true perspective of the value of a spiritual life as well. Again, I'm not saying materialism is not important, but it's only important so far it is subjugated and uses and serves the path towards spirituality. There should be a marriage between the two. But when spirituality is divorced from the material quest, that results in insolence increasing. The second characteristic is the man of virtue will become perverse. The Gemara in Sanhedrin says that in the time which the son of David, meaning Mashiach, will come, the generation will become extremely brazen, and a man of virtue will become perverse. Rashi explains, right, what this means is that people who otherwise should be honored will be despised, but the swindlers, the ones who should be least respected of all, are going to be the ones who are elevated in order to emulate. And that's exactly what you find nowadays. Anybody who's making a buck, it doesn't matter even it's in an ingenuous way, everyone wants to know why. How did he do that? Wow, that's great. Look how much power he has. Look how much wealth he has amassed. Yeah? And therefore, the people who are not necessarily the greatest people in the world are nevertheless the ones who are the most respected. Why? Because they are successful in a world which is hedonistically oriented, which means they have the key of power, which in that society is money, or it's wealth, or it's belongings, or it's, what did you say? Women? Yeah, women. Yeah. And therefore, right, a pimp, yeah, somebody who's nothing other than a pimp, yeah, is like greatly respected. Wow, that guy's really got the great life. Why? He's part of the jet set. He drives around with a Lamborghini, changing the person in the front seat every day or a few times a day. Wow, that's great. What an accomplishment. Yeah, what were you going to say?
I was gonna say also, like, I was thinking John Gotti, like in the '90s, but I was also thinking like maybe somebody, not just money and fortune, but something like, or not like fame, somebody like Bruce Jenner who does something and then he gets like an ESPY award for it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean,
when like young girls who have cancer and and they're the ones who deserve the ESPY, like don't get it.
Right.
Somebody like him has changed like that.
Right. And even we find it even in the Jewish world, right? People are honored for the contribution to promulgating Jewish values in the world, and they themselves are not Jewish or married to non-Jews. It's like a farce. Yeah? Why? Because we are. Why? Because the person happens to be a successful actor, yeah, or very wealthy patron, and therefore, right, this would represent the type of thing that we're talking about. That the man of virtue will become perverse. What this means is that a person who is truly a man of virtue will be despised by others, while a person who is truly despicable will be admired. The third thing is the vine will grow its fruit, yet wine will be expensive. The vine will grow its fruit means there's going to be plenty of material bounty, and according to the laws of supply and demand, everything should be cheap. But the problem is, despite the material bounty, everything's going to be artificially much more expensive. Why? Because again, the wisdom behind their marketing finds ways of making you part from your money in the best way possible, which means that you should be spending as much as possible, as frequently as possible, so that what is in your pocket should be in mine. Right. Yeah? So therefore, there's going to be plenty of bounty, plenty of blessing. Look at all the advertisements. Look at all the billboards. Look at all of the consumptions that are in place. Look at all these great stores. Yeah? Yeah? But all of it is all for the purpose of generating ways and mechanisms to get the money out of our pockets and into somebody and somebody else's. Another explanation here is that prices will be artificially jacked up because despite the plenty, food, for example, will be artificially wasted in order to keep prices up. There's plenty of food to provide for the poor even for free or for very cheap. But in order to sustain the market, the food is intentionally destroyed in order to keep the prices artificially high. And that's considered to be a voracious form of materialism, which is going to characterize this period of Achris Hayamim. The fourth is the government will turn to apostasy. The government will turn to apostasy. This is referring to Jewish government in particular, right? Even though the Jewish people should be ruled by Torah-believing Jews and Jews who are observant and who are regulating society, Jewish society, according to the teachings of the Torah, the Jewish society and the leaders in particular, the government will turn to apostasy. And what this is referring to is the prediction that at the end of days, when the Jewish people return to the land of Israel, as Yaakov himself returned to the land of Israel, initially they're going to be ruled by a government of non-believers. And unfortunately, as we know, that the early Zionist movement, and it's the position of most of the positions in Zionism today, is to uproot the Jewish people from the Torah. Any Jewish or Torah aspects of Israel are basically concessions, but not something which is actually tolerated or even desired. And therefore, unfortunately, we see that the government of the returning Jews to the land of Israel at the end of days, before the period of the coming of Mashiach, is predicted as being this non-Jewish, this non-religious, this non-observant, this non-believing government of Israel. And the Gemara says that Mashiach cannot come until the apostasy of this non-observant government is removed. And the laws which are antithetical to the laws of Judaism should be nullified. Yeah.
Is that why you see a lot of very religious and observant Jews that are anti-Zionist?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. I mean, they're anti-Zionists insofar as they oppose the fact that many aspects of the Zionist movement are about uprooting Jews from Judaism.
It's a secular government.
Yeah, they're not against the return of Jews to Israel. They're not against Jews living in the land of Israel. But things are better now than they were initially. But many programs and agendas of the early Zionist movement were outwardly directed towards uprooting Jews from Jewish observance. And the immigration of Jews from the Eastern countries was part and parcel with removing them from Torah, removing them from the traditional form of lifestyle, in order to amalgamate all of the Jews worldwide into the new Israeli, devoid of any religious belief or practice. And sometimes this happened in very ugly ways. Children were even kidnapped from their families in order to be taken to be raised in ways which were against the Torah, against the way of their parents. And I know this firsthand. And it certainly happened, and has been documented, happening among the Yemenite communities in Israel as well. Yeah, again, it's not my intention to entirely deface Zionism. I'm just saying that this is also part of the prediction, that towards the end of days, the period that we're living in, the Jews will return to Israel, but initially they're going to be governed by a non-religious, non-observant government, which actually has an agenda of non-observance. Yeah.
What's the point of the return to Israel if you're not going to be observant and follow the Torah?
You're asking the Torah's point of view, the teaching's point of view, or that Zionist movement's point of view? Ask the Zionists. Yeah, here we're in the yeshiva. But I get, certainly on another level, these people were reacting on the one hand to anti-Semitism, and they felt like the return of the body of the Jewish people in the land of Israel would be a way of solving the Jewish problem, independent of just physical security, independent of Jewish observance. So this would answer why, for example, a Jew might justify returning to the land of Israel, even though he's not going to observe the Torah, because he's looking for a safe haven for his people. So they have strong feelings about the Jewish people, like many Jews have nowadays, yeah? But they're not interested in Jewish observance. This will represent kind of like the physical redemption of the Jewish people, making a Jewish renaissance by bringing the body of the Jewish people back into the land of Israel, even if it's not observant, for the purpose of ultimately preparing the body of the Jewish people for the next stage, which is to infuse that body with the soul being the spirit of belief and practice. And therefore, this is also part of the divine plan in preparation for the end of days. God, of course, is behind directing the worldwide return of Jews to the land of Israel, even if it's under the guise of Zionism without Torah. The purpose is to prepare the Jewish people for being infused with the soul of redemption.
Through a lot of these, it might sound ridiculous, but they all sound like kind of like Islamic State kind of thing right now. A lot of these values and things right here are happening right now.
Yeah, the only difference is that it would be our position that the implementation of belief and practice would not be in a perverse and violent way. We're not talking about beheading people.
No, I'm not talking about like man of virtue becoming perverse and in like a funny way, like they are growing their fruit, but things is becoming costly because they're not importing things. So like things.
Yeah. Oh, you mean to say
So
the negative?
say is proving this.
You mean to say I misunderstood you? You mean to say that they
A lot of these things are like some of them literally are happening.
Yeah. Okay, very good. So that's also a possibility. Yeah? I'm directing the criticism more towards the prevalent kind of Western culture that's spread out through the world. But if you see similarities in that respect, then that's also possible. Let's do the fifth one. There will be no admonition. What this means is that in people's pursuit of physical pleasures, they are not going to be open to any rebuke. You're not allowed to tell anybody what you're doing is wrong. That's politically incorrect. Let everybody do what they want. Let everybody fulfill their heart's desires. Let everybody fulfill whatever it is that they want to do, and don't get in their way. Why? Because life is multicolored. Life is a rainbow. Let people do what they want. Yeah? Don't get in their way. Don't admonish. Nowadays, you can't open your mouth. If you say anything against anything, right, then you become public enemy, number one. You should be able to say anything as long as it's not expressing a religious point of view. Yeah? That you can't do. Quiet. Number 6, the house of the wise will serve prostitution. What does this mean? The house of the wise will serve prostitution. 2 explanations. One explanation, the house of the wise, meaning the governments, the places in which the chosen of the people reside, they will serve prostitution. Governments will serve all of this type of consumption. Another explanation of this is that the wisest people in society, their intelligence will be harnessed for what? For the purpose of prostitution. Like we said before, wise people will not be harnessed to contribute positively to society as much as the greatest minds in the generation are going to be used to figure out all of these platforms and all of these mechanisms and venues through which we can exploit other people. So the house of the wise is going to be used for prostitution. The 7th one is the Galilee will be destroyed and Israel's borders will be desolate. In our times, we see that the northern part of Israel is attacked again and again by Hezbollah and by all the other terrorist organizations. We now have ISIS, as you mentioned, on the borders in the north. Think about what's happening there in Syria. There have been times in the not too distant future when thousands of Jewish inhabitants vacated their homes in the Galilee, in the north of Israel, to come temporarily settle in the middle of Israel, to get out of the missiles' range. And we find the same thing happening in the south. People vacating the villages and the towns and the moshavim and the kibbutzim in the south because of the barrage of missiles coming from the Gaza Strip. So all of these border inhabitants are being removed from their homes, yeah? And the places are left to be desolate. Why? Because nobody is settling there. Number 8, the border inhabitants will roam from city to city and no one will pity them. This seems to be a very clear reference to the fact that those Jewish inhabitants that were encouraged to settle in all of Israel, including the area which is called the Gaza Strip, were forcibly removed from the government, promised that they would be recompensed and receive homes within Israel. And to this day, there are still inhabitants who were coaxed to leave their homes in order to give them over to the enemies of Israel, under the promise that they would receive housing in Israel and all types of grants to help them become reintroduced into Israel society. And they're roaming from place to place. They got nowhere to go. Number 9, the wisdom of the scholars will come odious, and those who fear God will be despised. What is this reference to? Anybody who's observant. All the more so, somebody who learns Torah is despised in the eyes of the general populace. He's a parasite. He's not contributing anything positive to the world. He's just a drain and a strain on society. Nobody cares and recognizes the value of Torah, and therefore people despise what Torah scholars and observant people in general have to contribute to society. The 10th thing is, the men of truth will flee. This is a reference to the fact that people who do want to espouse Torah teachings, they will be ostracized and removed and find a need to depart from society. Why? Because they have no place there. They have no way of feeling at home there. There are quite a few other of the things on the list here. I don't want to go through all of them, but one in particular I do think we should go before we break is, we'll read through quickly, youth will insult the elders, and the aged will stand before the youth. We see even nowadays that in the old days, people would stand or give their chairs for older people. Now, elderly people stand while the young people sit. And even elderly people buy into it by worshiping youth. And every second old man is taking Viagra in order to continue, extend his youth into his old age. Right? This youth worship is practiced even by the elderly. The son will dishonor the father, the daughter reside with the mother. Right? Sons don't care about the admonition of their fathers anymore. They openly do whatever they want to the fathers. The father can't say anything about it. And usually that's because the father does the same things. So he's going to tell the son not to do what the father's doing. Or a mother, a daughter won't accept the admonition of her mother when she says, preserve yourself, guard yourself, protect yourself. She says, Mom, you're outdated. Right? It's old news. The 13th thing is, a man's enemies will be members of his own family. Think about it. Nowadays, children plot the death of their parents in order to receive their inheritance while the parents are still alive. And you have all types of internecine challenges and competitions between people in order to and families are destructed as a result of that. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying, wouldn't that kind of thing happen in like royal families as well?
Yes, that's true. Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's true. That's true. But it's also a reference to the way in which the general family fabric has just deteriorated. And even in times of old, there might have been those types of things, but the general family structure was intact. And nowadays, there's really very little left of it. 14, the face of the generation will have the appearance of a dog. What this means is that the consumption of non-acceptable, non-kosher things will make human beings much more animalistic, so that their faces become dog-like. And they'll no longer have the special, unique human glow that is particular to human beings and different than animals. That's one explanation. Another explanation is that when you see somebody walking his dog, it looks like the dog is leading the owner, because the dog is walking ahead. But you don't realize the dog has a way of ever so subtly looking back to see which way the master is going, and it adjusts its course accordingly. So too, the leaders of the generation have the face of a dog, meaning the leaders look like they're leading the generation, but they're actually being led by their followers, so that the generation is looking behind to see what the constituents are saying, and as a result of that, they are making their decisions. And a third explanation of what it means about the generation having the face of a dog is that when you throw a stick at the dog bites the stick. It lashes out against the stick, but not the one who threw it. So too, in this generation, God is sending us all types of messages in the form of throwing sticks at us. Wake up, you're going in the wrong way. And what we do is we lash out at the sticks and we say, this is happening for that reason, or this reason, or the other reason, and don't realize, like a dog, that really these are sticks being sent to us by God to tell us, hey, you're going in the wrong direction. Wake up, readjust your path. The 15th and the final of the things which are listed here is the son will not be embarrassed in front of his father. And we mentioned that not only will the son not honor the father, not only will the son not hearken or take into consideration the opinions of the father, because of course the father is closer to being a Neanderthal, but really he is going to not be embarrassed in front of his father, and the most brazen way, do things in front of his very own father, things which would generally be considered unacceptable, but in nowadays age of openness, of tolerance, of being politically correct, of it being impossible to castigate anybody, to reprimand anybody, the son is open to do whatever he wants, and he's not embarrassed about his father at all. And I mentioned a key reason for that might very well be because the father himself is doing those very same things that the son is doing. So the son says, what are you telling me not to do it? You yourself do it. What's the father going to say? Yeah, but I'm 38 and you're only 18? What's the son going to say? What's the difference? If you can do it at 38, I should be able to do it at 18. And he goes ahead and he does it. So these, I think, are a list of 15 things which our sources say will indicate the period of Ich v'Seder Mashiach, the type of orgiastic, indulgent, materialistic, non-spiritual approach towards the end of days, things which we see coming into fruition in our very times. This sets the stage for the next period of the end of days, which is the wars of Armageddon. And the next time we meet, that's what we're going to talk about. Armageddon and the wars of Gog and Magog. Okay.